What happens when the man everyone assumes is out of place turns out to be the new boss? In one Dallas hotel, that answer left the staff speechless and unemployed. You ever seen a man walk into a room with quiet confidence, only to have the world look at him like he didn't belong there? That's exactly what happened to Donald Price one Friday evening in Dallas. Donald was 43 years old, a man who carried success in the way he stood, the way he moved. His tailored navy suit was crisp, his shoes polished, his expression calm. After a week of brutal negotiations in San Antonio that had stretched late into the nights, he wanted nothing more than rest. The Langmore Grand Hotel, a high-rise tower of glass and steel in the heart of downtown Dallas, was supposed to be his sanctuary. He pushed through the revolving doors, the cool blast of air conditioning brushing his face. The lobby was vast, marble floors gleaming, chandeliers casting a warm golden glow. Guests in evening wear sipped cocktails near the bar, while a pianist played soft jazz in the corner. Donald carried only a small overnight bag, no entourage, no fanfare, just a man who wanted to put his feet up after sealing a deal worth millions. But from the moment his shoes tapped across that marble, he noticed the stares. The front desk clerk, a young man with slick back hair, glanced at him, then at the bag, then back at Donald. His eyes narrowed, subtle but sharp, as though weighing whether this guest was supposed to be there. Donald caught the look, but brushed it aside. He'd faced it before, in boardrooms, restaurants, airports. He placed his bag gently on the counter. "Evening," Donald said evenly. "Checking in." The clerk didn't smile. Instead, he cleared his throat and asked, "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes. Price Donald Price." The clerk tapped at his keyboard, expression shifting between fake politeness and suspicion. Then, almost too quickly, he looked up and said, "I don't see you in the system." Donald leaned slightly closer, voice steady. "I confirmed earlier this morning. Try again." At this point, a woman in a gray blazer, clearly a floor manager, approached. She eyed Donald's bag, then looked him up and down like she was scanning for something out of place. "Sir," she said firmly, "are you sure you're in the right hotel? We don't allow loitering in the lobby." The words hit harder than they sounded. Around them, guests sipped drinks and pretended not to stare, but their ears perked. "I'm not loitering," Donald replied, still calm. "I told him, I have a reservation. My name is Price." The manager exchanged a look with the clerk, then picked up the phone at the desk. Her tone dropped, sharp. "Security to the front, please." Donald exhaled slowly. He had been through too much in life to raise his voice now, but every second felt heavier. Every pair of eyes in the lobby locked on him like he was a spectacle. A family sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably. A man at the bar whispered to his wife. Within a minute, 2 security guards arrived. Both were broad-shouldered, wearing matching navy jackets with the hotel's logo stitched on the sleeve. "Problem here?" one of them asked. The manager crossed her arms. "Yes, this gentleman is not a guest. Please escort him out." Donald turned to face the guards directly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I told them I have a reservation. My assistant booked it under my name, Price. Maybe double-check before you put your hands on me." But the guards didn't check. They didn't even glance at the system. One stepped closer and said, "Sir, let's go." Outside, Donald's jaw flexed. He looked at the marble floor, then at the chandelier overhead, then back at the clerk who couldn't quite meet his eyes. Slowly, he picked up his bag. "I can walk," he said. The guards flanked him as he was escorted out. The entire lobby watched silently, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Donald pushed through the revolving doors, back into the Texas heat, his dignity intact, but his patience tested. Standing on the sidewalk, he paused. Cars rolled by on Main Street, headlights cutting through the fading light. He tightened his grip on the handle of his bag, the sting of the insult sharp in his chest. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal hours earlier, and yet, here he was, treated like he didn't belong in a place he now technically owned. He walked to his car, parked across the street. It wasn't a flashy sports car, just a sleek black sedan, understated but powerful. Sliding into the driver's seat, Donald set his bag down and rested his hands on the wheel. The sting gave way to thought. But this wasn't the end. Something was about to shift in a way that nobody inside that lobby could have predicted. Inside the Langmore Grand, the air was still thick after Donald had been escorted out. Guests whispered at cocktail tables, their conversations hushed but animated. Some shook their heads, others shrugged as if to say, "Not my business." For the staff, it was just another incident handled. But for Donald, standing outside in the Texas evening heat, the insult was still burning. He didn't storm off. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he stood by his car, staring back at the glittering hotel lobby through the glass doors, weighing every possible move. Donald Price had built his career on patience. Deals worth millions didn't come from rash decisions, but this wasn't about business strategy. This was about respect, something he had earned, but had just been denied. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With one swipe, he called Kendra Lowe, his longtime assistant. She picked up on the first ring. "Donald? You checked in yet?" He let out a humorless laugh. "Not exactly." "What do you mean, not exactly?" "I confirmed with the front desk this morning. You might want to hear this in person." "Can you get over here?" Kendra didn't waste time. "I'm 5 minutes away." While he waited, Donald leaned against his sedan, watching guests continue to file in. A couple in evening gowns stepped out of a taxi, greeted warmly by the very same staff who had just dismissed him. Minutes later, Kendra's silver Lexus pulled up. She stepped out, clutching a leather folder under her arm. Kendra was in her mid-30s, sharp, quick-witted, and fiercely loyal to Donald. She had been by his side through boardroom wars, endless negotiations, and the occasional scandal. She could spot an insult a mile away. "What happened?" she asked, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached. "They tossed me out," Donald replied simply. Kendra froze. "What do you mean tossed you out?" "I walked in, gave them my name. Manager said I was loitering. Security came, walked me out like I was trespassing." Kendra's mouth fell open, then tightened into a thin line. "After everything, after buying this place, they treated you like that?" "Yeah," Donald said, his tone flat. "They didn't even check the system. Just assumed." She glanced back at the lobby, her eyes narrowing. "You want to file a formal complaint?" Donald gave a small shake of his head. "No. I want them to understand who they just embarrassed, and not tomorrow." Tonight, Kendra understood immediately. She opened her folder and pulled out the thick packet of acquisition documents, the ink still fresh from last month's closing. Donald looked at them, then back at the hotel. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Absolutely," he said. "I'm not letting this slide." Back inside, the staff were already laughing about the incident. The young desk clerk whispered something to the manager, who smirked as she checked her phone. They didn't notice Donnell and Kendra re-enter the building. The revolving doors spun, and the room seemed to pause. Donald walked in with measured steps, Kendra close behind, a folder tucked firmly under her arm. The guards from earlier straightened, surprised to see him back so soon. "Sir," one of them began, but Donald raised his hand. "No need," he said calmly. "I know exactly where I'm going." The manager's smirk evaporated. She stepped forward quickly. "Sir, we've already asked you to leave." "You're not allowed to loiter." Kendra snapped open the folder, pulling out the top sheet of paper. Her voice cut sharp through the lobby. "This man isn't loitering. He's your boss." Gasps spread through the guests nearby. The pianist faltered mid-song, his fingers stumbling over the keys. Donald locked eyes with the manager, his expression unreadable. "You didn't even check my name," he said. "You didn't ask twice. You just assumed I didn't belong." The young clerk looked down at his shoes, his face flushing red. The guards glanced at each other, suddenly unsure of their footing. The manager opened her mouth, then closed it. Her voice cracked slightly as she said, "I don't understand." "Let me help you," Donald replied. "My name is Donald Price. I'm the new controlling partner of the investment group that owns this hotel. And you just escorted me out of my own property." The lobby went still. Every guest within earshot stared, some with wide eyes, others covering their mouths in shock. Donald let the silence hang, stretching seconds into what felt like minutes, but he wasn't finished. Something bigger was about to unfold, and the staff could feel it pressing down on them, like a storm about to break. Donald didn't rush to speak again. He stood in the middle of the lobby, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The sound of clinking glasses had stopped. Even the pianist had stepped away from the keys. All eyes were on him, waiting for his next move. Kendra moved closer, sliding the folder onto the counter in front of the stunned clerk. The thick stack of documents landed with a heavy thud. "That," she said, tapping the top page, "is the deed transfer. Effective 3 weeks ago. You all work for him now? The clerk swallowed hard, his face pale. The manager's lips parted, but no sound came out. It was the kind of silence where even breathing felt too loud. Donald broke it with a low voice, steady and controlled. I built my career on patience, on listening before I speak, on weighing every option before I act. But what happened tonight was more than a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something ugly. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably under his stare. He wasn't addressing just the staff anymore. He was addressing everyone watching. You saw me walk in here with a small bag and no entourage, and the conclusion was simple. I didn't belong. You decided that before I even opened my mouth. A man at the bar, wearing a dark blazer, muttered, "He's got a point," under his breath. His wife nudged him, whispering for him to stay quiet. Kendra placed a hand on Donald's arm. "Maybe we should step aside," she whispered, but he shook his head. "No, they need to hear this." He took a slow breath, remembering nights long before the Langmore Grand, back when he was still clawing his way up in the business world. He remembered the deal in Phoenix where a client assumed he was the driver instead of the man running the meeting. He remembered walking into a bank in Tulsa, being asked if he was waiting for the account holder. And now, after years of fighting for his place, here he was, again, escorted out of a building he owned. His voice softened, but carried even more force. "Do you know how many times I've been told I didn't belong in a place? How many times I've been doubted before a word left my lips? Too many to count. But tonight was different. Because this isn't just another hotel. This is my hotel. My signature is on your paychecks." The manager finally found her voice, though it wavered. "Mr. Price, I didn't realize. If I had known—" Donald cut her off, his tone sharp. "That's exactly the problem. Respect isn't about knowing titles. It's not about who owns what. It's about how you treat people before you know their name." The room grew hotter with tension. Guests exchanged looks, some uncomfortable, others visibly moved. A young couple by the piano whispered to each other, their eyes wide. Donald stepped back from the desk, his presence filling the space. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his voice was louder than any raised tone could have been. He glanced at Kendra, then back at the staff. "When I was escorted out 20 minutes ago, I had two options. I could walk away, let it slide, chalk it up as another insult, or—" He paused, letting the words stretch. "I could come back and hold you accountable. Which choice do you think I made?" Kendra's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. She'd seen this side of Donald before, the side that didn't settle, the side that refused to let ignorance dictate the story. The manager's hands fidgeted at her sides. "Mr. Price, please. If you give us another chance—" Donald raised a hand. "I'll decide what happens next. But know this, your actions tonight told me more about your values than any polished resume ever could." The words sank deep, not just into the staff, but into every bystander who had witnessed the scene. People weren't just watching a business owner scold employees. They were watching a man turn humiliation into a lesson in real time. But Donald wasn't finished. Something bigger was coming. He wasn't going to leave this confrontation hanging in the air. He was about to set the stage for a revelation no one in that building would forget. The lobby was heavy with silence, every eye still fixed on Donald. But instead of pressing forward right then, he took a step back, almost as if the weight of the night demanded a pause. His hand brushed the folder Kendra had placed on the counter, and for a moment his expression shifted, measured, contemplative. "Kendra," he said quietly, "let's take 5 outside." Without waiting for an answer from the staff, Donald turned and walked back through the revolving doors. The buzz of Dallas traffic greeted him, headlights streaming past on Main Street. Kendra followed quickly, her heels clicking against the concrete, frustration written all over her face. "You're too calm," she muttered, adjusting the strap of her purse. "They dragged you out of your own property, and you're giving them breathing room." Donald leaned against his sedan, folding his arms. "Calm doesn't mean soft. It means I'm about to make sure they remember this night for the rest of their careers." Kendra studied him for a moment, then opened the folder again. The paperwork was more than proof of ownership. It was a weapon. Contracts, signatures, letters of intent, all binding. "So what's the move?" she asked. Donald's gaze shifted back to the hotel's glass facade. Guests were still peering out, curious, whispering. He could almost feel their anticipation pressing through the glass. "The move," he said, "is to go back in, gather every employee who touched this situation, and show them exactly who's in charge." Kendra raised an eyebrow. "You're going nuclear tonight?" "Tonight," Donald replied firmly. "Not tomorrow, not next week. They'll never forget how fast tables can turn." She gave a sharp nod. "Then let's go." They crossed the street together, Donald walking slower this time, deliberate. Heads turned from the bar inside as the revolving doors spun once more. Guests craned their necks, waiting to see what would happen. The guards stiffened immediately when they saw him. One stepped forward nervously. "Sir, I think we need to—" Donald lifted a hand, silencing him. "No. What you need to do is call every staff member working tonight, right now. I want them in this lobby within 5 minutes." The guard hesitated, glancing at the manager. The manager's face flushed crimson. "Mr. Price, surely we can discuss this in your office." "No," Donald cut in, his voice calm but razor sharp. "We'll discuss it here, in front of your team, and in front of the guests who just watched you drag me out like a trespasser." The murmur among the onlookers grew louder. A man in a sports coat whispered to his wife, "This is unbelievable." "He owns the place?" She whispered back, "Imagine being them right now." The manager swallowed hard, then turned to the clerk. "Gather everyone." Within minutes, the staff began to trickle in. Housekeepers in uniforms, bellhops, waitstaff still carrying trays. They gathered in a loose circle in the middle of the marble lobby, eyes darting nervously. Some knew nothing of what had happened. Others had seen it all. Donald stood tall at the center, Kendra just behind him with the folder open in her hands. His voice carried across the room without the need for a microphone. "My name is Donald Price. As of 3 weeks ago, I'm the controlling partner of the group that owns the Langmore Grand. That means every paycheck you cash has my signature attached to it. Tonight, I came here quietly, with one bag, looking to check into my own property. Instead, I was treated like a trespasser. I was humiliated in front of guests, escorted out by security who didn't ask a single question." A ripple of shock ran through the staff. Some looked at the manager with wide eyes, others shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight you," Donald continued, "because I didn't need to. I knew the truth would surface soon enough. And now you all know it too." Kendra stepped forward, handing him a single page from the folder, the final signed deed. Donald held it up briefly, then laid it back down on the counter. "This paper says I own this place. But respect isn't written in ink. Respect is shown in how you treat people when you don't know their titles, when you don't know who they are. And tonight, you showed me and everyone watching exactly where you stand." The room was thick with tension. The pianist sat frozen on his stool. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, captivated. The staff fidgeted, waiting for the hammer to drop. But Donald wasn't rushing. He wanted every word to land like a stone in still water, rippling outward. And as he looked around at the faces before him, he knew the decision he was about to make would leave a mark not just on this hotel, but on every soul standing there. The staff stood in a wide semicircle, their eyes darting between Donald and the manager who had called for security earlier. Some clutched notepads and aprons, others still wore latex gloves from the housekeeping carts they had been pulled away from. The tension was so thick that even the smallest sound carried. A woman's bracelet clinked against her glass at the bar, and half the room turned their heads. Donald let the silence breathe. He wanted every single person in that room to feel the weight of the moment. His voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Let me tell you something," he began, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "You don't really know a person until you watch how they treat a stranger. That lobby moment, when I walked in with my bag and a reservation, that was your test, and you failed it." The manager, pale and tense, stepped forward. "Mr. Price, if I had known—" Donald cut her off, his voice sharp but steady. "That's the point. Respect isn't conditional. It doesn't depend on who signs your paycheck or whose name is on the deed. Respect should come first, before the title, before the money, before the paperwork." A few staff members lowered their heads. Others stared at the floor, wishing the marble would swallow them. Donald turned his focus directly on the clerk who had first dismissed him. You didn't even look twice. You typed my name once, then told me I didn't exist in your system. When I insisted, you let your manager step in and handle me like a problem. Do you know how many times in my life I've been treated like a problem before anyone knew who I was? The clerk's throat worked as he tried to swallow. Sir, I thought... No, Donald interrupted. That's exactly it. You thought. You didn't check. You didn't ask questions. You decided. He let that word hang, decided, and the entire staff felt it sting. Kendra stepped forward, flipping through the folder until she pulled out a page with the Langmore Grand letterhead. She read aloud, effective as of August 10th, controlling ownership of the Langmore Grand Hotel is transferred to Price Holdings, LLC, under the authority of Donald Price. She lowered the paper, her gaze sweeping over the stunned employees. That was nearly a month ago. Every hour you've worked since then? Paid for by him? Gasps rippled through the staff. The bellhop, a young man barely out of college, looked like he might faint. The housekeeper clasped her hands together tightly, as though in silent prayer. Donald didn't move. His presence alone was enough to hold the entire room captive. I've built businesses from the ground up. I've walked into banks where they assumed I was the driver waiting for my boss. I've sat in meetings where they thought I was the assistant, not the man writing the checks. And I learned something. People will show you who they are before you ever open your mouth. You just have to watch. He gestured toward the guests sitting at the bar. Tonight, you all watched. You saw how quickly judgment can ruin someone's dignity. You saw how fast assumptions can stain a room. This isn't just about me. This is about the next person who walks through those doors and gets sized up in 3 seconds flat. What if that next person is your family, your father, your sister, your child? The silence deepened. Some guests looked down at their drinks. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Donald stepped closer to the manager now, his eyes locked on hers. You called security before you even confirmed my name. You humiliated me in front of your guests, and you did it with absolute certainty that you were right. Her lips trembled. Mr. Price, I made a mistake. A bad one. Please let me make this right. Donald's face didn't change. His voice was calm, almost too calm. You don't get to decide that anymore. I do. The room seemed to lean forward as one, every soul waiting for what would come next. And in that moment, Donald knew he had them. He had their full attention. The decision he was about to make would echo through every corner of the hotel, but he wasn't going to rush it. He wanted them to sweat. He wanted them to remember. And he wanted every single person in that lobby, staff and guests alike, to understand the difference between assumption and accountability. Donald let the silence linger a moment longer. The tension was unbearable for the staff. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, some holding their breath, others whispering quietly as though they were sitting front row at a play. The entire lobby had become a stage, and Donald Price stood at the center. He straightened his shoulders. Here's the truth, he began slowly. Some mistakes can be fixed with training. Some can be corrected with apologies. But tonight's mistake, it showed me something that can't be fixed. It showed me arrogance. It showed me carelessness. And worst of all, it showed me a lack of respect for basic human dignity. He turned to the 2 security guards first. You, he said, pointing at the taller one. Did you even once check the reservation system before putting your hands on me? The guard shifted uncomfortably. No, sir. You didn't, Donald cut in. You didn't question the order. You didn't hesitate. You saw me, you made a decision, and you carried it out. That might make you efficient, but it makes you dangerous in the wrong hands. The shorter guard cleared his throat, looking down. We were following orders. Donald's voice sharpened. Orders don't erase responsibility. A uniform doesn't erase accountability. Gasps rippled through the room. Guests could feel where this was headed. Donald shifted his gaze to the front desk clerk. And you, he said, you dismissed me without a second look. Do you know what that means? It means you believed your first impression over the truth, and your first impression was wrong. The clerk stammered, Mr. Price, I didn't... You did, Donald said firmly. And it wasn't just you. It was all of you who participated in this. He turned slowly toward the manager in the gray blazer, the one who had called security. Her face was drained of color, her fingers twisting nervously at her side. She started to speak, but Donald raised his hand. "No excuses," he said flatly. "You had the power to pause, to ask questions, to confirm. Instead, you jumped to the harshest response possible. You dragged a man out of his own hotel in front of dozens of witnesses. You didn't just make a mistake. You led others into it." Her lips trembled. "Please, Mr. Price, You're finished here," he said coldly. The words fell like a hammer. Gasps and murmurs broke out among the crowd. Guests exchanged wide-eyed looks. Some staff members looked horrified. Others seemed relieved, as though a weight had finally been lifted. Donnell didn't stop there. He looked back at the guards, then at the clerk. "And you three, security and front desk, you're finished too. Effective immediately." The announcement hit like a thunderclap. The young bellhop whispered, "He just fired them," under his breath, his eyes darting around in disbelief. The pianist muttered, "Never seen anything like this," as he stepped back from his bench. The fired employees stood frozen, their faces pale, the reality of their termination crashing down in real time. One of the guards opened his mouth as though to protest, but the words never came. Donald continued, his voice still calm but carrying a razor's edge. "The rest of you, take note. I don't expect perfection, but I expect respect. I expect you to treat every person who walks through these doors with the same dignity you'd give a head of state, or the janitor who cleans the restrooms. You don't know who you're dealing with until you know, and if you don't learn that lesson, this job isn't for you." The staff hung their heads. The guests were silent, watching history play out before them. Kendra stepped closer, sliding the signed deed back into the folder. Her expression was stern but calm. "You've just seen what accountability looks like," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby. "This hotel will not operate the way it did before." Not under his leadership, Donald looked around once more, his eyes steady. "I don't fire people lightly, but I will never tolerate arrogance disguised as professionalism. Tonight was a turning point. For me, for you, and for this hotel. Remember it." The air in the lobby felt electric, every word burning itself into memory. People knew they'd be telling this story long after the night ended, but Donald wasn't quite finished. He had one last lesson to share, one that would outlive the firings, the embarrassment, and the spectacle of the evening. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Donald stood in the center of the marble lobby, the manager and her staff still frozen where they had been dismissed. Guests whispered to one another, but most were too stunned to say anything at all. Donald let the room settle, then spoke again, slower this time, his tone shifting from sharp authority to something deeper, something that carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said, his gaze sweeping over both staff and guests, "that this was about anger. That I fired them because I was embarrassed. But you'd be wrong. This wasn't about pride. This was about principle." He walked a few steps toward the center of the lobby, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. When you dismiss someone without listening, when you judge them before you know them, you do more than make a mistake. You tear down the dignity of another human being. And that kind of damage doesn't get fixed with a quick apology. The guests were hanging on every word. Even those who had been sipping cocktails earlier now sat forward, elbows on their knees, eyes locked on him as though he were delivering a sermon. Donald continued, his voice steady and low, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I wasn't born into money. I wasn't born into boardrooms and high-rise offices. I grew up being told no more times than I could count, told I didn't belong, told I wasn't the right fit. And every time, I had two choices: walk away or stand firm. Tonight, when they threw me out of my own property, it reminded me of every one of those moments." Kendra, standing just behind him, watched closely. She had heard parts of this before in private conversations during long flights and quiet car rides, but she knew he had never shared it like this, to strangers, in the raw. "I didn't fight back at the desk," Donald said, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't argue when security flanked me. I walked out with my bag in my hand, but walking away doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it means patience, because 20 minutes later, I had the chance to return with the truth in my hand, and when the truth shows up, lies and assumptions fall apart." The manager, her face pale and eyes rimmed with red, shifted slightly as though she wanted to speak. But Donald's voice cut through before she could. I want every person in this room, staff, guest, whoever you are, to leave here tonight with this lesson. Respect should never depend on appearances. It should never depend on titles, bank accounts, or assumptions. Respect is the one thing you can give freely that costs nothing, but says everything about who you are. A murmur of agreement rose from the guests. Someone clapped once, then stopped, as though unsure if applause was allowed in a moment like this. Donald wasn't finished. His voice softened, almost conversational now, as though he were speaking to a friend across a table. You might never own a hotel. You might never sit at a boardroom table, but you will face moments where you're judged unfairly, or where you judge someone else too quickly. And what you do in those moments will define you far more than any resume ever could. He paused, scanning the room once more, then added quietly, remember this, power is temporary. Titles come and go, but character is permanent. The weight of those words seemed to settle into every person there. A woman near the piano wiped her eyes with a tissue. A young bellhop swallowed hard, clearly shaken but thoughtful. Even the guests, who had originally whispered in judgment when Donald was escorted out, now looked humbled, their earlier assumptions laid bare. Donald took one final breath. This hotel will change under my leadership. But more importantly, I hope some of you will change how you see people. Because tonight, you all witnessed how quickly assumptions collapse under truth. Don't wait until you're standing in my shoes to learn that lesson. With that, he turned slightly toward Kendra, who closed the folder and gave a subtle nod. Together, they started toward the elevator. Guests parted to let them pass, many murmuring quietly, some nodding with respect. Donald pressed the button, waited, and stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, he looked back at the lobby one last time. His final words echoed like a verdict. Never confuse arrogance with authority. Respect is the only thing that makes either worth anything. The doors slid shut. For those who had witnessed the night's events, the story would be told and retold. A lesson not just about ownership, but about dignity. And for you watching right now, ask yourself, how do you treat people when you don't know who they are? Because that answer says more about you than anything else. If you believe in respect, accountability, and standing firm in your principles, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this, because every story we tell carries a lesson worth remembering.